The expanded definition of unemployment, including discouraged job seekers, has increased to 43.2% in the first quarter. The construction sector lost the most jobs, followed by the private households and the manufacturing sector. Many suffered job losses as businesses had to cut staff numbers to stay afloat in the wake of the pandemic.
Let us look at the discouraged work seeker, for example. It increased by about 201,000 people, taking us to about 3.1 million in the quarter that we are talking about. That is the first quarter of 2021. Now, when you look at the other not economically active, they decreased by 38,000 and bringing us to about 14 million. So when you take the 14 million plus about the 3 million of your discouraged work seekers, they come together to about 17 million.
One such South African who gave up on looking for a job and found another way to make a living is Paul Maqubela. He worked for the South African Airways for over 10 years. Maqubela knew SAA was in financial trouble, but he never expected things to end the way they did. He and 2,700 other colleagues lost their jobs. Maqubela likens the COVID-19 pandemic to a final nail in the coffin of his career in aviation. After trying unsuccessfully to find another job in aviation, Maqubela, together with two of his former colleagues, started the Chisanyama. He says while this helps them to feed their families, they have made a deliberate decision to use local small businesses as suppliers to help feed more families.
Not in a million years did we think that SAA would close doors and let staff go the way things happened last year. I did not understand depression for the longest time. I experienced what was happening last year. We lost our jobs. We had to cut ties with a company that we loved dearly and that we had dedicated our lives to for years. So it was a rather challenging time and the worst experience one has experienced in life ever. Yeah, but here we are. We're living. We survived. We still continue with life.
The period ahead remains challenging in terms of employment prospects as the country battles yet another wave of COVID-19 infections and structural impediments to economic growth.
Things such as electricity shortages, things such as policy uncertainties. I mean, those factors are weighing negatively, and companies, as a result, they are very reluctant. At the moment, we have been seeing the developments in terms of the labor union negotiations, which are not aligning with the demands that the workers are demanding when it comes to the pays. So those factors all combined, they are affecting business confidence and the company's willingness to expand and employ more people.
While the relatively eased lockdown restrictions will help improve employment prospects, it's unlikely employment levels will be anywhere near those seen before the pandemic hit. Loras Safakomosi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, to make sense of these grim figures for the job market, let's welcome the Director-in-Chief Economist at Econometrix ZA, Dr. Azar Jammine. Azar, thanks very much indeed for joining us. It's not a pretty number, but I suppose some might say it looks better than it could have been.
Look, the fact is that we've been in a perennial spiral of rising unemployment now for a decade or so, and due to a variety of structural impediments to employment creation. But these particular figures were possibly slightly better than had been anticipated. I think on the whole, there had been an expectation that the unemployment rate would rise to 33% or more, rather than just edging upwards by 0.1% from 32.5 to 32.6%. And what we did see is that employment creation in the formal sector was a positive 79,000. Therein lies the rub, of course. The formal sector employment benefited, but informal employment, employment for domestic workers and employment for agricultural workers all declined by more than the number of jobs created in the formal sector. And that is an indication of and a reflection of the manner in which the COVID-19 crisis, far from leveling out the differences between different strata of society, has actually exacerbated inequality. Most of the people who have lost their jobs or received pay cuts have been drawn from lower income, lesser educated, lesser skilled people, many of them involved in the informal sector, whereas those like ourselves who are formally employed are still in our jobs, earning reasonably, paying our taxes, and surviving quite well.
Do you think then that we've reached the bottom of this, that we're not going to see massive increases or significant increases going forward, and that maybe it's leveled at this point?
I think in the short term, that is a fair assumption, simply because the economy is recovering and for purely statistical reasons is going to have grown by 3 to 4%, maybe even more this year, which should not allow for further increases in unemployment this year, and maybe even next year. The concern that most economists have is what happens after this initial rebound from the ravages of COVID-19. Will we return to the dismal declining growth trajectory that we had in the last decade, or can we ramp up to a much higher growth rate that we used to have that could actually start generating new jobs? And the critical factor here is government really going to come to the party to create the kind of structural reforms needed to reverse the declining trend of the economy and employment creation?
Measuring unemployment is just always one of those difficult and tricky things to do, because they talk about expanded unemployment, people who have stopped looking for jobs. I mean, for me, I look at a simple figure like 1 million people turned 18 last year. Some went to university, the rest we don't know where they are. So what do we know in terms of just how bad the job situation is out there if we put the official statistics to one side?
What we realize is simply just looking at the increase in the size of the population, and in particular the number of people entering the job market from schooling, we are just not growing the economy fast enough to accommodate them, unless we change the structure of the economy in such a way as to make it much more labor intensive. And that is not happening, and there is no incentive either for that to happen right now. We're talking about, 500,000 people entering the job market every year. And that means, given a total employment level of no more than 15 million, that you have to grow the economy by at least 3.5%. Simply to provide jobs. If you assume that employment creation and job and economic growth go hand in hand and have a one-to-one relationship, the economy's got to grow by 3.5% for 15 million current employment, to grow by 500,000 to provide jobs for the new for those entering the job market each year, and that's a tall order.
Where might these jobs come from? Where's the low-hanging fruit in the short term?
The biggest problem, one of the problems, and this is where COVID does have an impact, is one of the more labor-intensive sectors is, of course, your restaurants, leisure, hospitality, tourism industries. And those are still in dire straits and are likely to remain in dire straits as long as the outside world keeps banning South Africans from traveling and banning their own citizens from traveling to South Africa. So we are really left now in the short term. The mining industry is receiving a bit of a boom, but it's become so capital intensive that the number of jobs potentially to be created from that is relatively small. Agriculture is where the hope lies in the very short term. We are experiencing very good agricultural production this year, as was the case last year, and one would hope that we would see more job creation there. But there again, the introduction of minimum wages has led to a reluctance on the part of your large farmers to want to employ labor at a high cost, and have been and are inclined to prefer to just employ machinery to do the work. It's been wonderful the way South Africa has been maintained its food self-sufficiency, but it's come at the expense of huge increases in capital intensity, in a sector which really could provide a lot of labor and jobs.
In an ideal scenario, that a lot of these jobs that were lost perhaps might have come back when these restaurants and other places came back online. But what we know is that some of those institutions, some of those businesses are not coming back. So there are a lot of jobs that are permanently lost. So again, I come back to that figure that you said of what we need in terms of growth to create jobs. It seems to me that we probably need even more, because there are jobs that were lost permanently that need to be created.
You're absolutely right, Peter. When I mentioned 3.5% growth, it was simply to prevent the unemployment rate from rising still further. In other words, we need 3.5% growth just to absorb the new entrants into the labor market. In order to actually get the unemployment rate to fall and to create a net number of new jobs, you need obviously economic growth of 5% or more per annum. And we haven't had that since the period 2004 to 2007. And hey, presto, what followed after that was the removal of our president by the ruling party, despite the fact that the economy had been growing by more than 5% per year for 4 years in a row. And ever since then, the economy under a new regime has been in a downward spiral.
All right. Azar Jammine, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for your insights on this pretty grim figure. Thank you so much.